Today we're going to take a look at the Powkiddy X55. Let's get to it. The Powkiddy X55 is a Linux-based handheld gaming device. It has a 5.5-inch display. It's powered by Rockchip's RK3566, a quad-core ARM Cortex A55 CPU that runs at 1.8 GHz, and it has 2 gigs of LPDDR4X RAM. A couple of items worth calling out. The IPS display runs at a resolution of 1280 by 720 and a 16 by 9 ratio. It has 2 microSD card slots, and there's a 4000 mAh battery in here that advertises upwards of 4 hours of game time. For ports, we're looking at 2 USB-C, 3.5mm headphone, and HDMI. It supports Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and all of this weighs in at 293 grams. First off, let's talk about the OOBE. For folks who are unfamiliar with what an OOBE is, it's the out-of-box experience you have from the time you take the device out of its packaging up to the point where you can actually use the device for its core purpose or for what it was advertised as. The out-of-box experience for the Powkiddy X55 was fairly straightforward. It came in a pretty cool box that has technical drawings of the X55 on the sides and front. So as you rotate the box, you can see a drawing that represents the top, the face, and the bottom of the device. Our unit came with a console, a USB charging cable, and a user manual. It booted right up. We were at the GelOS logo in a few seconds, and the main screen in just under a minute. The first thing we noticed when we picked up the X55 is the feel of the build. It's hard to put this in a way that doesn't sound like an insult, but it kind of has a high budget or low mid-range feel to it. It's kind of plasticky, not terrible by any means, but it feels like an electronic device that you paid $100 for. I don't want to harp on this too much because, all things considered, for $100 it's actually well put together. All I'm saying here is that when you first pick it up, you're going to notice that it feels about right for the price range. The A, B, X, Y buttons are pretty nice. They have a good amount of travel though, and sometimes when in the menu system it feels like they don't always register the intended action unless you intentionally fully press them in, and I'm pretty sure this is related to that travel. The X55 has digital shoulder buttons and they're pretty good, but they're also pretty clicky. Not too loud, but if you were playing in a quiet room, others will likely hear them. The D-pad is large, and is essentially the same size as a D-pad on an Xbox controller. However, much like the A, B, X, Y buttons, it also has a lot of travel, and this might result in feeling like presses aren't always registering actions. It feels large for the device, but serviceable. The thumbsticks are reminiscent of Switch thumbsticks, though they feel a bit more plasticky and are a tad stiffer. Start and select are split across the device along the far edges of the bottom. I had to make a slight hand adjustment to reach them, but it wasn't too awkward. The weirdest buttons are the volume buttons. They're right next to the start and select buttons and are the same size, so you're going to have to fidget around a bit to make sure you're on the right button, but the reason I call them weird is because they feel reversed. I expect volume down to be on the left and volume up to be on the right, like they are on Steam Deck, Ion Odin, Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, and others. I don't know, it just feels backwards. The screen is a lot nicer than I initially thought it was. Prior to the first system update, it seemed a tad washed out and a little too dim, even after adjusting the settings, but after the first update that wasn't the case anymore. With a little tweaking of the brightness, gamma, and saturation, I was able to get it looking pretty good, though it definitely doesn't get bright enough to use in well-lit scenarios without issue. The 5.5-inch size is definitely a bonus here in the overall visual department. The sound isn't too bad. It's nothing spectacular, but definitely not terrible. It can get a little tinny at higher volumes though. The speakers are along the bottom, and how they sound is going to be affected by how you hold the device. The power and reset buttons are up top, and easy enough to reach, but be warned, that reset button is all-powerful. Pressing it restarts the system, no questions asked, so be mindful when you're over there rattling L and L2. The X55 is running a Linux-based OS called GelOS. Here they're using a front end called Emulation Station. Since it's Linux, it's not just another software layer, rather it's fully integrated into the OS experience. Emulation Station has a great look, a nice set of features, and is an all-around great front end for a handheld emulator. The first thing we wanted to do was make sure that our X55 was up to date. So we went into the main menu by pressing Start, went into the network settings and toggled Enable Network On in the network configuration section. Back at the main menu, we went into System Settings and selected Start Update from the System Update section. This process took about 5 minutes in total, and the system auto-rebooted once the update was complete. Before we hop back to the main menu, let's take a look at the main screen. The main screen focuses on games, though there is a section for favorites, music, and tools. The Tools section has some options for cloud backup and restore, file management, some cleanup tools for Mac users, and links to launch the Inbox emulators directly. The Music section takes you to a screen where you can launch GMU Music Player and play local music. Pressing the select button on the main screen brings up a quick access menu where you can kick off a screensaver, restart the front end, restart the system, or power down. We don't have any games here yet, so let's hop back to the main menu. It's a pretty extensive set of options. We're not going to deep dive here, but let's touch on a few things to get you up and running. Game settings lets you tweak things like shaders, game save states, and aspect ratio. There's a subsection for per system configuration that lets you tweak things even further, even allowing you to pick a different emulator. You can also enable retro achievements here, which is great to see baked right into the system settings. Game collection settings lets you tweak the library settings. You can do things like change sorting, make custom collections, and toggle system visibility on and off. When you enable retro achievements and log into an account, there will be a retro achievement section in the main menu, but for us it never populated with data. Achievement pop-ups showed up in-game and showed up at retroachievements.com, but this section stayed blank regardless. The next main section is system settings. There's a lot of useful stuff in here. It's where you can tweak the time zone, clock settings, and check for system updates. But the display subsection is likely where you're going to spend most of your time. I've upped the brightness, gamma, and saturation from the default settings and continue to revisit this section as I play different games in different scenarios. The other item of note in this section is the scaling governor. It can be thought of as a system level over or under clock. I recommend setting it per game instead of changing it here. Okay, leaving this section and hopping into the UI settings. Here you can change the theme and a few other display options, though it's curious that the other display options, brightness and gamma and the like, aren't also in here. This section also has a setting to let you switch the A/B buttons over to an Xbox layout versus the default Nintendo layout behavior. Okay, I'm going to skip the controller and sound sections because they're fairly straightforward. The network section is worth a quick peek though. This is where you can enable Wi-Fi, but can also enable cloud and VPN features. The Moonlight section lets you set up the service so you can stream games directly from your PC. This is another setting that's cool to see baked right into the UI. And the last section is Scraper. This is where you can manage where the system checks for game art and how much you want to sync. You'll need to set up a free account at Screenscraper if you want to use that service, and while the other two are free, they do have limits to how much a device can pull down a day. I'm not sure what those limits are, but we hit them. Okay, now that we've covered the bulk of how you can maintain the system, let's add some games. If you bought a system that didn't come with games, you'll need to add an exFAT formatted SD card to the TF2 slot at the bottom of the console. Power down the device, place your card into TF2, power it up, and the system does the rest. Power the device back down, remove your SD card, and place it into an adapter on the PC where your ROMs are. You're going to see that GelOS added a bunch of directories to this card. From here, it's a matter of putting the right ROMs into the right folders. Here's the folders that I use for this video, but you can learn more about mapping at the GelOS wiki. Keep in mind that the Powkiddy X55 is capable of emulating up through PSP and Nintendo DS, so plan accordingly. But before you copy over all those PSP games, just know that PSP takes a lot of tinkering per game, and even then some still struggle. Alright, eject the card from your PC, place it back into the TF2 slot, power up your X55, and once you get back to the main screen, it should look something like this. Press the Start button to bring up the main menu and hop into the Scraper section. Log into your Screenscraper account and select the items that you want to pull in, and select Next. This could take a little while depending on how many games you put on your SD card. Let's take a tour of the game section. If all went well, you should see some box art and description text associated with all your games. You may have opted to pull down game videos as well, and these should show up when you hover over a game for a few seconds. You can turn autoplay off by pressing the select button and setting game list view style to detailed or basic. Pressing left or right on the D-pad or thumbstick will take you to the next console, so you don't have to return to the main screen to switch systems. Okay, so you have all your art in place, but what if it's not what you expected or not there at all? While hovering on a game, press the X button to bring up a set of options. From there, select Scrape. This should bring you to a list of available art and metadata. If it doesn't, select Input, change the name, and try again. Once something shows up, select the listing that you want by pressing A. Back at the game list, you can further tweak things like game names by hovering, press X, select Edit Metadata, and change the name there. It's worth calling out that you could point to local art from this same menu. A couple of other things. You can tweak how the game runs by pressing the Select button and selecting Advanced System Options. From here, you can change emulators and also apply that scaling governor that we talked about earlier. As far as getting your games up and running, that's about it. Lots of games work with the default settings, but now you know how to tweak things if needed. For the most part, in the systems that we tested, aside from the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation Portable, a majority of games ran surprisingly good with just the default settings. While N64 and PSP games ran mostly okay with default scaling and resolution, things got bumpy when we started scaling them. Each one took some trial and error to find that sweet spot between performance and visuals, and not all were able to scale without some significant performance hit. At the higher end, while we were generally impressed with the Nintendo DS games with the default settings, we didn't experience that same consistent level of performance in PSP emulation. There were a good number of games that needed tweaking to get acceptable performance on the PSP, and even then, things like choppy audio sometimes surfaced. I suspect that this would be the case for higher-end systems like Dreamcast as well. All in all, we were generally impressed with game performance on the X55. It struggled with PSP games at times, but with a bit of tweaking, we were able to get most playable. And aside from that platform, everything else was pretty hands-off, just launch and go. For a device in this price range, performance is more than acceptable. So what's missing from the Powkiddy X55? This really isn't a missing thing, but you may have noticed that we didn't cover the Portmaster option found in Tools. Unfortunately, none of the options in Portmaster work for us. Selecting any of them simply dropped us back to the main screen. If this changes in a future OS update, then we may do an update video, but unfortunately for now, it's not working. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but the buttons felt laggy every now and then, and while sometimes that felt like the lag was a mispress due to travel distance, there's definitely lag in the main menu and setting sections. The power display seems to have lag sometimes. Every now and then, when coming out of sleep, it didn't refresh the percentage number for a few seconds. This was also the case when charging. This didn't happen a lot, but it was enough to notice. We ran into a situation where our 128 gig cards kept corrupting when taken out of the system after the initial ROM copy. We tried 3 cards and it happened on all of them. We're still testing to see if this is something on our end, but we've never run into this before with other handhelds. We'll update if we find out what's up, but if you hit the same issue, let us know in the comments. Alright, so what are my final thoughts on the Powkiddy X55? You can get an X55 for as low as $100, and that's including shipping if you go through powkiddy.com. You can sometimes find them in Amazon for less than $130, but I wouldn't pay more than that. Either way, this is a device that you can pick up for about $100, and I feel like that's a very fair price range. When I first held it, I said something along the lines of, yeah, this is definitely a budget device, but everything in our testing since that statement has exceeded expectations. The 5.5-inch display looks great and is quite a bit better than expected. Game performance is impressive up to PlayStation, and even some of the higher-end systems are very playable, but you're going to have to roll up your sleeves at times, so take that into consideration. While we weren't able to get a full 4 hours out of the battery while gaming, we routinely hit the 3-hour mark, which is still impressive. It has more feature support than most hardware in this range does, and I'd argue that it even has more than a few more expensive devices do. HDMI out, Bluetooth, a headphone jack, game streaming via PC, SD card support, multi-controller support. This is a great list of features and support to see in any handheld gaming device, let alone a $100 one. The launcher UI is so well integrated into the overall experience that the X55 feels like a proper handheld. This makes for an excellent experience for users of all levels. For about $100, you're getting one of the best budget handheld emulators available in 2023. At the end of the day, there aren't a lot of scenarios where I wouldn't recommend the Powkiddy X55 to someone. It's a great little handheld at a great price. And that about wraps things up. Please like this video if you found it useful, and subscribe to our channel if you want more content like this. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this, and we'll chat again soon.